All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Module 8, New Terrorism and Homeland Security. All right. So, the last section, we talked about how Homeland Security is organized in the United States. And now we're going to actually get into some of the terroristic threat and some of the domestic security threats that we face here in the United States. So, one of the terms you're going to hear that's used to describe terrorism since 9/11 is new terrorism. Um, so, policymakers, analysts, they've described the terrorism since 9/11 as different from the terrorism before that. So one of the this new terrorism kind of this principal attribute that they uh, have for the modern era. It's a destabilizing global influence, and it signified kind of this marked escalation in lethality and more this use of modern technology and modern networking. They've changed the types of weapons they use. They've changed their target selections. Um, and now they have these advanced communication technologies that terrorists use to disseminate their message globally. Like prior to all of this, you know, terrorists were much more limited in the things they could do. Um, Attacks were much more surgical. There wasn't this thought of trying to create these mass casualty events or use these high yield weapons. But since 9/11, there's been this shift toward those things. So the new terrorism is characterized by a loose, cell-based organizational structure. You don't have these kind of bureaucratic, top-down kind of organizations anymore. It's much more loosely based. They have asymmetrical tactics. There's been the threat and use of weapons of mass destruction, potentially high casualty rates. There's a lot more of a religious or mystical motivation involved in the new terrorism. And they're also able to influence much more widely through the use of the internet and the 24-hour news cycle on cable news outlets. So that's kind of what new terrorism is called, but really defining terrorism itself is very, very important. Because if you can't define terrorism, it's hard to make policy decisions because you're making policy decisions based on what is and what is not considered to be terrorism. So being able to define what terrorism is very, very important. But herein lies the problem. All right, so since there's been people have been trying to define terrorism for a very, very long time, and there's some consensus on some types of attributes that need to be included in a definition of terrorism, but an actual definition of terrorism is far from unanimous. There's not really a whole lot of agreement on a definition of terrorism. Academics have definitions of terrorism. Countries have definitions of terrorism. Government agencies have definitions of terrorism. News outlets have definitions of terrorism. Uh, Pretty much any entity that has anything to do with terrorism at all, they all have their own definitions of terrorism, and they all kind of define terrorism however they see fit to fit whatever it is they're trying to do. Even within the U.S. government, agencies do not have a single definition of what terrorism is. The terrorism definitions are all molded to fit whatever their particular mission or whatever their particular agency is responsible for. This is where you kind of get into this that old saying, one person's terrorist, another person's freedom fighter, right? So if you're trying to define terrorism, think how hard that would be, especially if you get to like the international level. Think about the UN. Like, how could you create a definition of terrorism at the UN when you have such stark differences in beliefs about what is terrorism, who's a freedom fighter, those sorts of things? But come to some kind of definition of terrorism is extremely important when you're starting to talk about how you're going to make policy decisions and figure out how you're going to address terrorist threat. Um, so, three things that play into these definitions of terrorism um, are combatants, or the definitions used for combatants, non-combatants, and use of force. So that's one way that they use to determine whether something is terrorism or whether it's not, depending on who the targets are and the amount of force that's used. So combatants are conventional or non-conventional adversaries who engage in armed conflict as members of an actual like military or guerrilla fighting unit. So soldiers, okay, of some type. Non-combatants are civilians who really have no connection whatsoever to military or security forces. However, sometimes that line gets blurred between who are combatants and who are non-combatants. Okay, sometimes uh, civilians actually become combatants, even though they look like civilians, right? So you have this blurring sometimes of the lines between who are the actual combatants and who are non-combatants. Also, sometimes you have these guerrilla fighting units that set up within civilian areas, to try to get protection for themselves because being amongst civilians. Uh, then the type of force, so indiscriminate force, which is the application of force without trying to limit it at all. Not trying to limit the amount of force, not trying to limit the degree of destruction, right? Just indiscriminately using whatever force you decide you want to use. Then you have discriminate force, which is much more surgical use of force. It's much more limited use of force. So again, even though these sound like clear definitions, when you get kind of in the middle here, sometimes that line becomes blurred a little bit because what's a wartime environment? In a wartime environment, different types of force are it's more moral to use different kinds of force if you're not in a wartime environment. Well, what's a wartime environment? Well, it could depend on who you talk to, right? Terrorist groups often try to justify their use of indiscriminate force, but generally speaking, discriminate force is often considered to be a moral use of force when it's used against specific targets with the intention of limiting collateral damage. So what was old terrorism? Yeah, we talked about new terrorism. We talked about defining terrorism. But what's old terrorism? Well, before 9/11, you had much more clearly identified organizations and movements. Okay, things were much more clear about who was who and what was what than it is now. Use a lot more conventional type weapons, small arms and explosives. There were usually real clear, kind of explicit grievances, championing either specific classes or ethno-national groups. There were ideological and nationalist justifications for revolutionary violence, and a much more kind of surgical selection of targets. It wasn't this thought that we need to create these mass casualty events. So our grievances against these people or this target, and so we hit that target, but we don't just hit everything around it to make sure we get that target. There's actually a table in the book that compares old and new, and that's really pretty clear. You ought to check that out. It really lines it out pretty good for you. So how has terrorism changed? We talked about old versus new. Well, it's obviously changed over time. There's four kind of phases of terrorism in the modern era: of left-wing, ethno-nationalist, Palestinian nationalist, and then religious. And the religious terrorism phase kind of heralded the dawn of this new terrorism. One thing that has kind of persisted through terrorism is what's called the contagion effect. And this is when a successful terrorist attack may lead other people to be motivated to commit a copycat or a similar incident. One thing that studies suggest leads to this is media coverage. Groups learn from one another. Maybe one group thought, well, that's not possible. Nobody can do that. Then somebody does it, and they're like, oh man, we could have done that. And then they go out and do those same things. Or, if a terrorist group is looking for media attention, looking for recognition, somebody does a terrorist event, lots of media coverage, lots of ability to disseminate their message, and then other groups may, well, we need to do that too, so we can do that same thing. All right, so prior to 9/11, we've already talked about the Cold War some, but the Cold War and this competition between East and West kind of really defined the terrorist environment prior to 9/11. You had the Soviet Union, who generally sided with nationalist insurgencies, while the United States generally sided with the established governments. These insurgencies oftentimes had characteristics of Marxist revolutions, um, while the governments were seen as fighting against the spread of communism. So the Soviet Union was communist, the United States was not, the West was not. So the Soviet Union supporting these Marxist revolutions that could have led to communism, while the other governments were seen fighting against the spread of communism. The Soviets and the Chinese armed and financed the wars of liberation, oftentimes against U.S. supported regimes. And this nationalism and Marxism were kind of synthesized by these 20th century's revolutions, Mao Zedong, Ho Chi Minh, Fidel Castro, uh, left-wing revolutionaries in the West kind of drew on the examples of these people, Mao and Ho Chi Minh and Fidel, um, to justify the acts of violence against Western democracies. So prior to 9/11, the Cold War really kind of defined this era of terrorism. All right, left-wing terrorist environment. Uh, the main heyday for the left wing was the 60s to the early 80s. Um, you had groups in Latin America, you had groups in Western European, you had pretty significant campaigns in those areas. In Latin America, you're talking about primarily Marxist groups operating in both urban and rural areas. In Europe, they had very little terrorism in the Eastern Bloc prior to the Berlin Wall coming down in '89. Uh, Western Europe had a wave of terrorism in the '60s in conjunction with student and human rights activism. There was terrorism in several countries in Europe. Some were nationalist type groups, but most were ideological. The ethno nationalist terrorist environment, at the heart of that is nationalism. Nationalism promotes the aspirations of groups that are distinguished by cultural, religious, ethnic, racial heritage. Something distinguishes one group from another. But the guiding motivation of the ethno nationalist terrorist environment is some kind of national identity. So during post-war, after World War II, ethno-nationalist terrorism is occurring both domestically and also internationally, and it's kind of ebbed and flowed over time. There's more of it, and then there's less of it. There's more of it, then there's less of it. Um, but by the late 1990s, ethno-nationalist terrorists were generally just operating within their home countries, but still occasionally attacking international targets. Palestinian nationalists, beginning in the 60s, Palestinian nationalists were perhaps the leading practitioners of international terrorism. They were joined by Western European and Middle Eastern sympathizers. By the late 90s, the creation of the governing authority on the West Bank and Gaza led to Palestinian terrorism focused on targets inside Israel and other occupied territories. But since September 28th, 2000, it's had characteristics of both broad-based uprising and also communal terrorism. So it's characterized by violent demonstrations, street fighting, suicide bombings, and other attacks versus civilians. By the late 80s, much of the Western support had ceased, but Middle Eastern extremists continued to support the Palestinians and use it to justify their own violence. And finally, the religious terrorist environment. Beginning in the 21st century, the most prominent practitioners of international terrorism were religious. Islamist movements such as Al Qaeda and ISIS were the most prolific ones, but there's been extremists from many different religions that have participated in terrorist activities, not just Islam. Prior to 9/11, the most significant incidents of religious terrorism in the U.S. were the bombing of the World Trade Center in 1993. That was the first kind of religious terrorist attack that we suffered. Also, American embassies in Kenya and Tanzania were bombed. The USS Cole was attacked by a boat bomb. So there were a few religious terrorist attacks on the United States or our interest prior to 9/11. All right, so most major religions have factions of extremist adherents who have engaged in terrorist violence. It doesn't really matter which religion, right? Although most religions are religions of peace, and the overwhelming majority of people that adhere to these religions are peaceful people. Okay, so we're not talking about just mainstream, religious people when we're talking about this. We're talking about the extremist adherents within these religions. So, Christians, you have single issue, terrorist and Christian identity terrorist. Jewish, you have the Jewish Defense League. Hindu and Sikh, you have violence in India against Muslims, and also separatist violence. Buddhist, you have Aum Shinrikyo. So you have examples of extremists within every religion. Religious terrorists is Political violence conducted by the true believers uh, who have fervent faith in the fact that what they're doing is sacred. Their cause is righteous, right? We're totally justified in doing what we're doing because any actions we take on behalf of the religion is not only justified but blessed. So they believe that they're defending their faith from non-believers, or our faith is indisputable and a universal guiding principle that must be advanced for the salvation of the faithful. But here's the catch. Oftentimes there's political issues underneath these religious motives. They use religion um, to really get people riled up, and because religious beliefs are deeply held beliefs. Um, but often there's political issues at work underneath those religious motives. So religious terrorism oftentimes is not strictly based just on religion. There's other issues going on as well. But the religious terrorism in this modern era is a little bit different because it's an international focus. Prior to this, there was religious terrorism, but it wasn't always international. All right, but it is a central feature of the new terrorism. Characterized by asymmetrical tactics, cell-based networks, and discriminate attacks on soft targets and threaten high-yield weapons. Kind of this strategy was pioneered by Al Qaeda, other Islamist extremists. And religious extremists know that this strategy receives extensive attention. And it's also difficult for adversaries to defeat them using these kind of tactics. Because one of the studies that I've read referred to Al Qaeda as a dune organization. So if you think about sand dunes, right, a sand dune will show up. Well, and then before you know it, like the wind and the weather, or whatever, that sand dune will be gone, and then now there's a sand dune over here. So you have these dunes that pop up, and about the time you realize that there's a dune there, the dune is gone, and now the dune is over here. Right? It's very hard to address that when you don't know where that dune is going to pop up next. Right? Also, kind of in conjunction with this whole thing, is we now live in a very globalized era. You have global trade, political integration across the globe. That's all allowed these extremists and terrorists to provoke target audiences a long way away from their home territory. Like they couldn't do that before, but in this new age, they were able to. They could affect this global community much more so than anybody ever could before them. They have current technology. They can broadcast images. They can broadcast their ideologies. They can broadcast videos. They can broadcast their own interpretations of events to millions of people across the world with just a couple of clicks. Right? They can reach everywhere in a very short amount of time. Okay, another characteristic of the new terrorism is asymmetrical warfare. So asymmetrical warfare is use of unconventional, unexpected, and unpredictable methods of political violence. Right? So if it's symmetrical, it means the two sides are the same. Asymmetrical means that they're different. Okay, so terrorists will intentionally strike unanticipated targets and apply different tactics. So that allows them to seize initiative, redefine security environments, overcome traditional protections, overcome traditional deterrent policies. But this isn't something new. Okay, asymmetrical warfare has been around forever, but it's become this core concept, core feature of the new terrorism. Theoretically, they want to acquire and wield high-yield arsenals. They want to strike unanticipated targets, cause mass casualties. So an example of this is using like a regular motorized vehicle to attack a soft civilian target. A truck bomb. Driving it into just civilians. Okay, that would be an asymmetrical tactic. Weapons of mass destruction are also kind of a feature of this new terrorism. Okay, so this redefined morality of new terrorism, where high-yield weapons and mass casualties and all these things are okay, has opened the doors for these new methods with these high-yield weapons and targets with large populations. So why would you want to use these? Well, you attract attention if you use one, right? You cannot ignore the fact that someone used some type of high-yield weapon. Some religious terrorists believe that it pleases God. They're carrying out a mandate from God, trying to bring about the apocalypse. They'll damage economies. Food and other products are contaminated. It influences enemies. right? The conversation is different between two enemies if one person has a high yield weapon and the other people don't, right? So after you use one, uh, demands and grievances would receive more serious scrutiny, or even just having one, right? Being able to prove that you have one changes the conversation. Another feature of new terrorism is what they call net war. Um, so when you're talking about these loose cell-based structures, you're talking about maximum flexibility. So this new terrorism incorporates this maximum flexibility into its design, and in furtherance of that, they use these new cyber and digital technologies, which allows for even more uh, flexibility, right? So net war theory uh, is an emerging mode of conflict and crime, uh, where they use this network form organization um, that's attuned into this information age. So that they'll be dispersed in small groups who communicate, coordinate, and conduct campaigns without any kind of precise central command. Okay, so they've made this strategic decision to establish virtual linkages rather than actual linkages, using the internet and other technology, um, adapting them to former organizational models, things like the chain network, where you had people, goods, and information that move along a line of separated context, kind of end to end. Okay, you have the star, hub, and wheel, where you have a central node, and then everything comes off like that. But everything goes through the central node. Like you can't go from here to here. You have to go through the central node and out. You have an all-channel network where you have this network of small groups where each group is connected to every other group. So that net war, it maximizes flexibility, not only in organizational structure, but in communication. Um, and part of that communication is using the internet, social networking sites, any of this other kind of technology. Social media sites, internet sites, they're used extensively by terrorists and extremists, right? There's constantly talk about how do we control this? How do we stop them from using it? Well, you're probably not going to be able to, okay? Because the minute you stop them one place, they find somewhere else to go. Um, so they've become very adept at using these websites and social media sites. They've made really attractive sites. They're user-friendly. They're interactive. They have music, photographs, videos, propaganda. You name it, it's on there. They've learned how to use encryption technology, which allows terrorist extremists to communicate directly using encrypted chat rooms. They even use online gaming, these online games that you can talk to people. They use those kind of technologies to communicate. Um, they're very, very good at doing this. And they really like these live kind of things too, because they can use that to communicate as events are unfolding instead of trying to post stuff later or, hey, we're going to, they can do it as, look at what we're doing. We're doing it right now. Uh, so they become very, very good at that. And it allows them a lot of flexibility because they no longer have to meet. Like you don't have to have these meetings anymore where people are sitting around together talking. They can communicate from wherever they are uh, and figure out what they're going to do. All right, so what kind of policy options do we have? Well, you have counterterrorism policy options, which are a proactive policy that specifically seeks to eliminate terrorist environments and groups. The ultimate goal here is to save lives uh, by proactively preventing or decreasing the number of attacks. Then you have anti-terrorism options, which is more target hardening, enhanced security, and other defensive kind of measures, trying to deter or prevent attacks. So the objectives here for counterterrorism are to disrupt and prevent terrorist conspiracies from operationalizing their plans, deterring would-be terrorists from crossing the line from extremism to violence, uh, implement formal and informal international treaties, laws, and task forces to create this cooperative counterterrorist environment, and minimize physical destruction and human casualties. They also want to counter extremism, and this is where we talked about coercive methods. Okay, so exclusively relying on those is very, the ability to do that and to actually counter extremist ideologies is pretty limited. You have some initial success, um, but remember, we're talking about ideas and beliefs here. So getting people to change those things using coercive methods is not a long-term policy option. So other types of methods, sometimes more conciliatory methods, are also sometimes considered. Peace processes, negotiations, social reforms, those things have happened in some places in the past and with some success. Um, but often they work in conjunction with coercive methods and keeping coercive methods still available as an option. All right, so how do we counter the new terrorism? Okay, counterterrorism in the new counterterrorism in the new terrorism uh, has to realize that these extremists can operate within emerging environments. Like they have to realize that these groups are flexible and that they're going to be showing up places where maybe we didn't think they were going to show up. So the models that are used have to be flexible enough to respond to those, and have to be careful not to rely only on previous models and previous methods because things are changing so fast. What happened last year may not have anything to do with what's going on this year. You have to fight against behaviors. It's different than other wars in the past. So you're talking about more amorphous fronts. Not always easily defined. Different kinds of strategies. So use homeland security measures, which is like target hardening, deterring attacks, thwarting conspiracies. You have to use covert shadow wars. Those things are fought outside the public scrutiny, using covert units, counter-terrorist financial operations. Okay, those are the types of things that are directed against bank accounts, foundations, businesses, and other means. Taking away the money. There's global surveillance of communication technology, right? Surveilling, if they're using this tech, figuring out how to surveil that tech, phones, emails, whatever they're using. And then identification, disruption, transnational terrorist cells and support networks. That requires international cooperation to track people across the world. And that's going to be intelligence and law enforcement agencies. But it's going to take all those things to counter the new terrorism, because this is a different thing than we've ever dealt with before. They're much more flexible. They're much more able to communicate and move and do things quickly than they have in the past. All right, with that, I'm going to stop there. Please make sure you do your assignments for this week. And if you have any questions, please let me know. I'll see you in the next module.